Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. Greetings and welcome back, Sam, to this podcast and webinar. We were very lucky to have you just at the onset of the Russia-Ukraine conflict to give us your insights, and now we have you back, some months afterwards. Lots happened since then. Could you give us your quick take on some of the lessons we've learned over the last 6 months and something a bit more about the recent counteroffensive that we've seen from Ukraine against Russia?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Bilal, for inviting me back. Certainly, a day before the invasion, a lot of things happened just hours after that really shook everything up. So it's great to be here and be able to give a retrospective. With respect to the state of the play right now that's been happening between Russia and Ukraine, what we've seen is a substantial turning of the tide, a gain of momentum on the Ukrainian side over the past number of weeks. We saw the Ukrainians be able to recapture Kharkiv in a major counteroffensive. They've allegedly liberated 4,000 square kilometers, according to Zelensky. Another 4,000 square kilometers is currently under stabilization. Kharkiv is a city in the northeast of Ukraine, as you can see on this map, and it's one of the largest cities in the country. This is not by no means a complete victory for Ukraine. It's only a small part of the overall occupied territory. Russia's occupied 1/5 of the country, but it's a major and significant one because Kharkiv is an integral component of Novorossiya, which is the Russian concept of ethnic Russians in Ukraine that are rightfully part of Russian territory. And from a logistical and practical standpoint, it contains two major supply lines to the Russian offensive in Donetsk. And that's the Kupiansk and Izium railway networks, which are the most important railway networks in northeastern Ukraine. Now Ukraine controls those supply lines, and Russian troops don't have the ability to bring food, ammunitions, and reinforcements very easily onto their own fronts. So Ukraine's got the battlefield momentum, and they just achieved a decisive victory. But Russia's still not out of the woods yet. The war in Kherson, which is located in the south, right by the Black Sea, near Crimea, is going to be likely a slow-moving Ukrainian counteroffensive. The Ukrainians have been able to isolate 20,000 Russian troops there by destroying the three main bridges, including Antonovsky Bridge. So I think that the Ukrainians are better positioned than the Russians to win in the end and force the Russian withdrawal, like we saw in Kharkiv or Snake Island or in Kiev earlier. But it's going to take a matter of months, most likely. And looking at the broader picture, Ukraine's goals of recapturing Donetsk, where they're still facing a Russian offensive, Luhansk and Crimea, that could take much longer than this.
And, this counteroffensive seems to be very successful. I mean, what do you attribute this to?
Well, the counteroffensive can be successful for a variety of reasons that are both related to Russian weakness and Ukrainian strength. Let's start with Russian weakness. The Russians have struggled to concentrate their forces along a single axis of advance. And that's been a problem ever since the beginning of the invasion. They come in with 170,000 troops to invade a country of 42 million people and occupy it, which is a really, really small armed force. And they attack from so many different directions. Crimea into Donbass. They attack the north with Chernihiv. They attack Kiev. They attack the south by the Black Sea, so it's Kherson, Zaporizhia. They never really concentrated their forces properly. And while they've gotten marginally better at concentrating their forces, since they abandoned their goals of Kiev and focused exclusively on the Donbass and the south for their main military operations, they left Kharkiv with all their supply lines very thinly spread. So I was speaking to a prominent Russian military analyst earlier today, a supporter of the war, and he was saying in some areas, the Ukrainians were outnumbering the Russians by 8-1. And to achieve a successful counteroffensive, all you need is 2 to 3 times. So the Russians were woefully underprepared and unwilling to guard their own major areas. So unable to concentrate forces and manpower shortages.
And Sam, one question I have is, doesn't Russia have this very large army? I mean, surely they could just completely overrun Ukraine.
They, in theory, could do that if they actually had a general mobilization which takes advantage of their demographic strength. But in reality, Russia's got a volunteer army, first of all, and the Russian military is chronically had a structural manpower deficit. So their target originally was 1 million for the armed forces. That was as a result of the 2008, 2009 Serdyukov reforms. They only had, before the war, maybe around 900,000 at the most. Now they've increased the cap from 1 million to 1.15 million. And we have no idea how they're going to make up the 100,000 that they had short before, let alone these additional troops. So they have a structural manpower deficit. The second thing is volunteers are really not wanting to join this war, especially in the major cities. The Russians are being forced to go to the poorest regions of the country, like Dagestan and the Russian Far East. And also there are a lot of reports of the soldiers basically being stiffed on payments. $5,100 a month is being offered to people at the age of 18 to 20. And they only discover after 6 months in military service, which is a requirement to get that money, and they're not being paid. Similarly, they're also trying to get people out of prisons. And if you look at the video from Evgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group at the prison recruitment, it sounds very dire. They're being asked to carry hand grenades so they can commit suicide on call. They're being asked to maybe send their children into prison, into the service as well, to absolve themselves from their crimes. And it's especially galling for them if the person who's recruiting them, like Prigozhin, has no connection to the court system and cannot actually act on the promises to give them any kind of amnesty. So there's no desire, even amongst the poorest and from the prisoners, to join, let alone the people who are more socioeconomically well off, the middle class, who would not really view the military as a career to begin with. So it's very, very hard to get this the younger generation motivated to fight. And that's really the problem. And there's only two ways this can be overcome. One is a piecemeal measure, like regional mobilization, like which Chechny's leader Ramzan Kadyrov talked about, getting 1,000 people out of each region, in theory getting 85,000. Crimea and Kursk, two other regions, have just gone on board with Chechny's plan. That's possible. And the second is an outright conscription draft, which would mean a special military operation, as Putin calls it, becomes an outright war. And Putin does not want to do that. So Russia's got structural manpower problems, and it's unclear whether they'll be able to resolve them. And Ukraine has got a highly mobilized, strong army with territorial defense battalions with 8 years of combat experience also integrated within them. And that's a big advantage for the Ukrainians.
And in terms of the recent counteroffensive, I mean, why did it happen now and not, say, 3 months ago? I mean, was this something in the planning, or was it just a recognition of some Russian weakness? Why did it happen now?
So the Ukrainians had several reasons why they were even telegraphing to this that the counteroffensive was only going to take place in September in a major way. They telegraphed the counteroffensive occurring as in a concentrated manner on the southern axis, so from Kherson all the way through the Black Sea region. They did not keep any evidence of what was happening in Kharkiv, which led to the spokesperson for the Bowen Brigade, one of the major brigades, to say this was a major disinformational offensive, and Ukraine caught everyone by surprise. So the Ukrainians wanted to create an element of surprise when the Russians were tied down and not expecting it. They were sensing the fact that Russians were moving forces a little bit at a time towards Kherson, to where the 20,000 troops that I mentioned were being moved in bit by bit from Donbass to Crimea, and they weren't staffing the Kharkiv front. The Russian Ministry of Defense was getting warnings from Russian pro-war telegram channels, Russian defense experts, that Kharkiv was vulnerable. They weren't listening. So they wanted to capitalize on Russian strategic mistakes, Russian intelligence failures and communication failures, and have an element of surprise. That's a big reason why I think they waited. Another reason was they wanted to attritionally weaken the Russian army. They're already seeing a situation where there may be as high as 48,000 dead, if you believe the Russian finance ministry reports, or more conservative estimates, a minimum of 20,000 dead and 80,000 injured from the war. So, and many of them, after their injuries, are being forced to fight in combat even after an adequate recovery. So they wanted to attritionally weaken the Russian military before they launched it. And finally, they wanted to secure an overwhelming number of Western-made offensive systems. So they want to strengthen their artillery reserves, their multiple launch rocket system reserves, and also, even more crucially, their HIMARS, which have been very effective in striking the bridges around Kherson, as well as the rear guard of the Russian military, and also the any kind of longer range equipment, not very long range missiles, but medium long range equipment that can strike Russia's ability to retaliate from Crimea. So they wanted to destroy Russian military infrastructure and also take advantage of just Russia's mistakes and create a surprise element.
And you mentioned the HEMA and some of the equipment the West has been supporting. Yeah. I mean, how sustainable is this Western support?
I think that the Western support is quite sustainable. And it's not going to be because the Russians threaten the West out of doing it. Because the Russians have used nuclear blackmail repeatedly. Whenever the West does something in the security sphere that they don't like, or wherever the West provides arms to Ukraine, they threatened to also strike our Western arms shipments and interdict them. They've never been able to do that. And this is not new to this war. This goes back to 2008. We're ahead of the Georgian War and also the NATO missile shield system debate. The Russians threatened to nuke Poland if the U.S. went in there. So the Americans are pretty immune at this point to Russian threats, and Russian threat mongering about Crimea, which Ukraine was supposed to face major retaliations for after the Saki air base attack. Nothing happened. So the only things that may be a limitation are fighter jets, which have always been viewed as an escalatory move that is comparable to no-fly zone. Though even that could be resolved if Slovakia hands over some of its MiG jets in exchange for stronger defensive assurances from its neighbors and a strengthening of its own fighter force, or if more F-16 start arriving in Eastern Europe. And the ATACMS, which are the very long-range missiles that can strike deep into Russian territory, just the way Russia, from deep into this territory, can strike Ukrainian cities. And Putin has already warned that's a red line that would bring the Americans into the war. So aside from those two, the jets and the ATACMS, and both of which are by no means ruled out entirely, I think the arms shipments are going to flow regardless of what Russia does or doesn't do. The big risks to Western arms shipments right now are Ukraine fatigue, people just getting tired of this traditional war and wanting to sue for peace, the collateral effects, which could enable populist and anti-interventionist forces inside Europe, especially inflation and rising gas prices. Those are the main limitations, as well as practical demands. We talk a lot about Russia is losing their Caliber and Iskander missiles and running out of ammunition that they need to source it from Belarus or North Korea. We don't talk about enough about how European and NATO countries are giving as much equipment as they possibly can. And they will have to take years to prepare for them because so many NATO countries are not spending anything near the 2% defense target that NATO set. The German Bundeswehr is one good example. I would look at EU statements from Borrell, even warning that ammunition to Ukraine is not finite, is not infinite. So there's limitations on the supply side. Those are the factors that will limit it, not anything that Russia does.
And you mentioned gas to Europe as a potential threat. Now, Russia seems to have cut off most of its gas, especially through Nord Stream 1 to Europe. I mean, is there any more leverage that Russia has over Europe?
Russia seems to have expended some of its leverage over Europe, but it's done so at a time that's deceptively dangerous. And this is what I mean by all of this. So at the start of the war, and even before the war started, the Russians said the sanctions would lead to a potential cutoff in the energy sphere. But they always sent mixed messages about that. We saw Russian ambassador to the EU, Vladimir Chizov, be like, the Europeans will never be able to stomach a complete gas cutoff, so we're not necessarily going to ever have that really be on the cards. We see other hardliners in the state media, Duma, Federation Council say, cut it off now, we'll catch the Europeans by surprise. So there didn't seem to be really a certainty as to whether Russia was going to make that step or not, but clearly it was something that was on their mind as a possible contingency in response to sanctions, and more definitively coming right from Putin himself, if the European countries continue to refuse to pay for gas in rubles after the SWIFT sanctions, after the sanctions on the central bank's reserves, both foreign currency and gold. Yeah, but the Russians really took a very gradual approach to cutting off gas supply to Europe. They did so randomly and in piecemeal. For example, cutting off gas to Bulgaria, which was in tandem with Bulgaria expelling a large number of diplomats, I believe 72, for espionage, and also causing some brief disruptions along the Yamal pipeline to Poland, and gradually reducing its flows from a heavy pour into Nord Stream to a trickle, just 20%. Each time claiming that turbine damage or other external factors were the reason for it, then they get the turbine parts being sourced even from Canada, and the problem still continues to linger. Now the Russians have made a definitive decision to cut it off because they see that sanctions are not going anywhere. They see that the ruble is not going to be used in a mainstream way, and they fear the Gazprom bank might be sanctioned completely anyways. So they feel they've got little to lose and potentially a lot to gain in terms of creating Ukrainian, or at least or sentiments about pro-peace sentiments inside Europe, preventing them from supplying arms. So they're cutting off supplies now in September, when European countries like Germany have their tanks 85% full, and I hope that by the time we roll into December and January, those tanks will be depleted, and they don't have any other sources because LNG, coal, nuclear energy, and alternative suppliers are too hard to find in such a short period of time. So the Russians have taken decisive action to cut off gas supply, and one that could be very dangerous, and let's hope it does not derail European resolve at this crucial moment to help Ukraine.
And there seems to be another area of tension for gas supplies to Europe, which is a new conflict building up between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where there's some new sort of pipeline, there's some gas pipelines that are coming through to the EU, which Europe wants to encourage for the next 4 or 5 years. And I'll show a map of this as well. But is this conflict, is this something that Russia could interfere with? Like who kind of the main players in this new front, it seems, that's building up?
So let's break this down. So the Ukrainians have been allegedly trying to open up a second front in this conflict with NATO support. That's always been the Russian narrative. I find that to be quite skeptical, but because there doesn't seem to be any evidence of Ukraine really coordinating in these areas. But that's what the Russians have been saying. The Russians say that it could have started in Georgia, where the Russians were continuing to move the border, and there was an independence referendum for accession to Russia in South Ossetia that was supposed to be held. That seems to have been postponed. And there were presidential elections in that region, which is one of the occupied regions, one of two occupied by Russia in Georgia. The other is Abkhazia. This is more towards the central part of the country and closer to Russia's borders. From that part, Georgia seems to have cooled down as a second front. Moldova, Transnistria was the other off-mentioned second front. And the Russians were claiming that Romania was going to invade Transnistria as part of a way of securing control over Moldova. And the Ukrainians and Romanians were somehow conspiring to threaten ethnic Russians and Gagauz there. There was explosions in the capital of that region, Tiraspol, which is a small strip that's near the Black Sea. But ultimately, there hasn't been a major escalation in spite of Russian rhetoric about Transnistria being part of Russia and threats to occupy it, which continue to this day. Now it seems as if that second front has moved to two areas at the same time, and the second front is actually opened. One is Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and that's a border dispute that flared up a year ago and now is already in the process, at least initially, of being resolved at the current Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. The second is, which is much harder to resolve because of the history and because of the fact that we've had a recent hot war there in fall of 2020, is between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So it appears as if Turkey, and maybe egged on by Western partners, believes that this is a perfect chance to achieve Azerbaijan's maximalist goals in Karabakh, because the Russians will not be able to intervene militarily on Armenia's behalf in any kind of substantial way. Armenia has already asked for assistance from the Collective Security Treaty Organization for help from the Russians, and the Russians haven't been able to comply. So I think that there's a taking advantage of the fact that Russia's quagmired in Ukraine, their military looks weak in Kharkiv, and let's go in. The Russians are concerned about Armenia's vulnerability, and they believe that maybe one of the only ways in which Armenia could sustain itself, if Igor Girkin, the firebrand nationalist on Telegram who criticizes Russian military all the time, is to be believed Iran intervening on Armenia's behalf. But the Iranians, for all their antipathy to Azerbaijan because of its relationship with Israel, is not necessarily willing to maybe take that kind of a drastic step. Equally, it's unclear whether Azerbaijan has the appetite for a long war. Skirmishes on Nagorno-Karabakh have generally lasted a matter of days and weeks in recent years and have not turned into protracted conflicts. So I think that Azerbaijan might just use this as an opportunity to make some more territorial gains beyond Shusha and get a stronger bargaining position in eventual peace talks. But the long-run impact is likely that peace talks, which are being discussed in April and May, are likely shelved. A possible threat to the Armenia-Turkish rapprochement, which has strengthened over the past almost a year, and probably get another blow to the 3+3 format for peace in the Caucasus. So Russia, Iran, and Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. If Armenia and Azerbaijan are in a state of open conflict, Turkey and Armenia's rapprochement starts to fade. Georgia-Russia relations remain very poor. It's very hard to see how that works. So we're looking at an unstable South Caucasus, but maybe not necessarily much of a big diversion of Russian resources at this point.
Okay. And we haven't so far talked much about Putin and how the recent, counteroffensive has impacted his standing. What's your perspective on Putin's standing and, perhaps some of the people around him?
And I just wanted to make one final point, was that Azerbaijan is still continuing to push ahead as a major gas supplier to Europe. They're increasing their exports by 30%, and we're looking at more than doubling their exports by 2027. Italy is going to be a big beneficiary. So this war and any of the tensions that have led up to it have not had any impact on Azerbaijan's exports to the West, or there hasn't been evidence that their relationship with Russia, which is quite close, has impacted that either. So that's just one last point. Turning to the issue of Vladimir Putin, and your very interesting question here, I would say Vladimir Putin's approval ratings, at least if you believe the official polls, which even the Levada Center independent ones are quite dubious, apparently increased from around 2/3 or 68% to an average of 80%. Approval since the war started. But there's also the selection bias that being opposed to the war could risk you up to 15 years in prison. for discrediting the armed forces or even calling a special military operation a war could get you into serious trouble. So taking that aside, I think that the majority of Russians are either supportive of the war because of the resonance of the narratives that back it, because the Ukraine being overrun by Nazis, the West launching a total hybrid war against us, ethnic Russians that should be part of Russia, Russia and Ukraine are one people. Those are consistently supported by the majority of Russians. So it's possible the majority of Russians understand the rationale for the war, but it's probably a lot fewer who actively support a total mobilization or fighting this war for many years. Equally, there's very few Russians who may be very outspoken and very impassioned about being against the war because of the propaganda that they've been fed and because of their own historical memory and worldview, and also the risks of dissent. So there's a lot of Russians who are indifferent, ambivalent, and that is something that's happening. And the ones who are energized about the war, either opposed to the war or blatantly in support of it, are frustrated by the war for different reasons. Obviously, the ones who are opposed to it are frustrated by and horrified by the war crimes and by the sanctions and by the isolation. The hardcore supporters of the war are frustrated by the fact that Russia didn't overrun Kiev in a week, or didn't take over Ukraine in a matter of days like they were promised. And they're looking and directing their blame much more to the Russian Defense Ministry and to the alleged corruption inside the Russian military, and not to Vladimir Putin himself. And that serves Putin's interests. So Putin will likely keep Sergei Shoigu, an emergencies minister, a civilian who's not highly respected by Russian nationalists or the Russian military, in charge, and then fire, so he's a scapegoat, and then fire a lot of the lower level commanders. We've already seen 2 commanders of the Western Military District, who are heavily involved in Ukrainian events, be dismissed in just 6 weeks. So that suits Putin. So Putin has this aura of kind of invulnerability around him, at least for now. But the Russian military and his subordinates are getting heat, and he's pretty happy with that.
And you mentioned Shoigu, and I've got a picture here of some of the other players, right, surrounding Putin. If we just go through some of the other guys, there's Gerasimov, who's the I guess the sort of head of the army. What's his position?
So Gerasimov was a person whose influence was greatly overstated inside the West, because he was seen as the architect of the hybrid war doctrine. So combining the disinformation offensive and military action and diplomacy. So particularly in this war, we've seen a very limited cyber campaign, maybe a lot of alleged attempted attacks, but not very many successful ones. Diplomatic disasters. Gerasimov used to be a line of communication between Russia and the West on deconfliction in Syria and other issues. And the Russia losing the information war inside Ukraine and in the West, maybe doing better in the global South, but that's not his purview. That's more the state media's purview. And then an inability to really sustain a hybrid war type campaign. So Gerasimov's doctrine, as it was called, has failed resoundingly in Ukraine, and therefore his influence has been quite limited. He's disappeared for periods. He's even been reports that some generals underneath him are reporting directly to Vladimir Putin now, as Putin takes personal charge of the war and hands off more and more matters of economic and domestic policy to his prime minister, Mikhail Mishustin. So he's there in theory, but his influence and standing has been diminished greatly by this war, even more than Shoigu's, in my opinion.
And then how about the famous Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen, the successful Chechen general or rebel?
So Ramzan Kadyrov has seen strengths and weaknesses coming out of this war. So he's seen strengths because his units, the RUSI, have become so important on the front lines. They were tasked with the assassination of Vladimir Zelensky in Kiev alongside the Wagner Group, private military contractors. They played a critical role in some of Russia's offensives in Luhansk, in particular the capture of Popasna. They're sending increasing numbers of volunteers to Donetsk. They're sending another 1,000, 1,200 troops into Kherson. And he's also been a very active voice for hardline maximalist ambitions. He crusaded against the Istanbul talks that would have frozen the war in March and April, and urged the Russians to not give up on their ultimate goal of taking over Kiev. And it seemed as if his arguments have won out. Now he's calling for the mobilization of forces at a regional level, leading that charge and getting support from various governors. So his standing in the Russian system and his influence in security policy has grown, so much so that when he hinted at retirement, which he does every so often, just to gauge and assess how much people miss him inside the Kremlin. It turns out a lot of people pretend to or do. He was thought of as being maybe a potential National Guard head or being moved upward. There's some hardliners who would even like to see him as Minister of Defense. But then there's the flip side. These forces, the Kadyrofsi, have a lot more spectacle and show, and they've really struggled to achieve major military successes beyond that. So they're contributing a lot of manpower, but a lot of cannon fodder, and not very effective forces. They're among the least effective forces, maybe reduced lonely forces that are less effective than them are the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic separatist militias. They've been accused of egregious war crimes, and so that's another problem for them, which adds to the criticism of Chechnya's very poor human rights record. The SBU of Ukraine has explicitly labeled Kadyrov and some of his closest associates as outright war criminals, and they would, if they had international law on their side, they would want to try to prosecute them. So his reputation is deteriorated. And also, as the Chechens are fighting in Ukraine for a war they don't really identify with or really resonate with, because there's a lot of people who still have a legacy and history of separatism and want to be apart from Russia and not even fighting this war for Russia. Ramani Kadyrov's own popularity in Chechnya has probably eroded, even as his stature elsewhere has increased. But his repression is so strong and his line with Putin is so strong, that I think he's probably come out from this war as at least a temporary winner, at least in his nationwide profile.
And then there's Medvedev, the former president and prime minister. Is he influential still or not? Like, what's his role in the administration in Russia?
Well, he's the deputy chair of the Security Council of Russia, and he was dismissed as prime minister. And I think his influence has marginally increased from when he was towards the end of his prime ministership, because he was already something of a lame duck, right? Alexei Navalny had linked him to corruption. He had already lost any kind of authority after the decision in Libya. So to allow for the no-fly zone, and then which served as a gateway to a NATO intervention when Putin thought that was a major cop-out to the West, he lost his stature. Now Medvedev is trying to reinvent himself as a hardline Russian nationalist with increasingly outrageous statements, like threatening plagues and disease, and quoting the Book of Revelation against Europe was his latest pronouncement, for example. Talking about the weaponization of food in a drastic way, like which was before the Black Sea grain deal, and talking about unfathomable consequences of the Ukraine entering Crimea or Finland joining NATO. In theory, his threats have been largely empty, and he's seen himself be regarded as an erratic and irrational figure, but he's also showing that even though he was seen as a softer, more reformist and pro-Western a decade ago, he is now among the more hardline supporters of the regime. So maybe the loyalty factor has kind of strengthened around him. So he's seen as a loyal surrogate. I don't think he's really benefited his influence by doing what he's doing.
And in terms of, what's likely to come ahead of us now, obviously Ukraine, they've done well in the south of Kherson, in the northeast, Kharkiv. Now, will Zelensky and the Ukrainian military try to make a move to reclaim the Donbass region and also Crimea or not?
So that's a very good question. I think that the Donbass and Crimea are going to be much harder to achieve than even Kherson for several reasons. First of all, the Russians have occupied these territories for 8 years. So they have a substantial amount of defensive fortifications and military infrastructure. In Crimea, you have to destroy a well-established occupational authority, the Black Sea Fleet in its entirety, as well as the Russian base presences in Sevastopol, and the Russians have the Kerch Bridge, which still remains intact, despite the Ukrainian threats to destroy it, that can move more resources easily from into Russia. In Donetsk and Luhansk, you have a similar thing, an 8-year system. You have local proxies who may be untrained and may have suffered 50% plus casualties in certain brigades, but they are useful cannon fodder, and they have versatility now, fighting even as far flung as Kharkiv itself. There were some Luhansk militias who moved from Kharkiv into Luhansk and now into Donetsk. We're seeing that movement happening. So they have a lot of military infrastructure and the ability to fortify and entrench themselves a lot easier than they did in Kharkiv or even Kherson. So the Ukrainians face a difficult struggle here. The Luhansk governor Sergei Haidai put it best, saying that Ukraine will ultimately win, but it's not going to be Kharkiv style. It's not going to be fast. It's going to be very long. It's going to be very attritional. And given the fact that Russia is desperate to not see this losing territory that it occupied before this war, it could take extreme measures to protect those territories. So there's always a risk of an asymmetric escalation. And I think that if the Russians continue to strike water facilities, railways, electrical and power supply, fuel depots inside Ukraine, they could cause so much weakening of the Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian disruption that recapturing those territories will take longer. But the more I talk to people in Zelensky's team, the fewer I find that people are willing to negotiate with Russia under any circumstances or stop short of capturing every inch of territory. So I suspect that Ukraine will continue to push for this, even if it means a war of months or potentially even years.
I mean, you mentioned negotiations there. I mean, are there sort of back channel talks to have some kind of peaceful resolution?
Well, there's always back channels. There's always offers of de-escalation that come forward. The latest one came from Mexico, which is talking about bringing India's Narendra Modi, Pope Francis, and the UN Secretary General together. We've seen Turkey say that the Black Sea grain deal that was just signed to allow food to be exported can be used as a stepping stone to Zaporizhia and then on to the full conflict itself. Erdogan and Putin are holding regular dialogue about Syria, the South Caucasus, Ukraine, and many other issues. Emmanuel Macron continues his periodic dialogues with Vladimir Putin. Lately, they've been mostly focused around the Zaporizhia plant, but nonetheless, I'm sure Macron is trying to talk about a possible framework for de-escalation. But in reality, the big problem is the Russians and the Ukrainians themselves are not willing to come together for talks, and for reasons that both of them see as legitimate. For Russia, this war has become existential for them. They see this as this kind of total hybrid war against the West. And this would not be losing to having engagement with Ukraine without achieving their goals. Will not just mean holding off on some territorial annexations. It will mean that they challenge the Western unipolar order, and they claim to have been putting them down for 30 years, and they failed. They lost to the West. It'll be a moment of humiliation for them. It'll bring back the Versailles syndrome and the memories of 1991 and the post-Soviet transition. So that's why the Russians are so averse to diplomacy, even as their situation becomes increasingly dire. It may be in their military interest to freeze the conflict for a while, get another Minsk type agreement, regroup, reinforce, modernize their military, and iron out some of the problems that they had, and then strike again. But the nationalist euphoria and the nationalist fervor is blocking rational thinking from the Russians. So they come up with terms that are completely outrageous. The denazification of Ukraine, which implies that Zelensky needs to voluntarily resign and allow the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian education to be subsumed by Russian education. The demilitarization of Ukraine, reducing Ukraine to a force of allegedly 50,000 troops. That's completely unrealistic, right? And also allowing Ukraine to recognize territory that under Russian occupation, when the Ukrainians feel that eventually militarily they can recapture it. So the Russians, because of this fear of humiliation, are putting forward unrealistic terms. The Ukrainians equally are putting together terms that can only really be achieved through force, which is getting Russia out of all of its territories that it's occupied. And even some other secondary strengths, like there's now a rumor that they'll ask for the demilitarization of European Russia and the movement of Russian forces significantly far away from Russia's borders, which Russia will see as an infringement on its own sovereignty. So I think a diplomatic solution is very unlikely in the near term, not because other external powers aren't trying, but because Zelensky and Putin really don't have any grounds or any common ground to talk right now. There are red lines that can make diplomacy even less likely. One is a referendum held by Russia, a sham referendum to annex a certain territory, like maybe Zaporizhia or Luhansk, probably most likely those two. That would lead to a complete dead stop. Zelensky said that. The other would be the execution of the Azov battalion members who are being tried for their role in Mariupol. And the Russians have hinted the death penalty could be used in that case because they're terrorists. That would also probably kill diplomacy. So diplomacy is not 100% dead, but I would say it's 90 to 95% dead for the very reasons that I state, because their goals of Russia and Ukraine are incompatible, and there's nothing that the external mediator, whether it's from the global south or from the west, can really do.
And when we look at, say, Russia's attempt to control Chechnya in the 1990s, the first wave, Russia was not successful, but then they, I guess, paused and then recaptured it, under Kadyrov, I suppose. Is there anything to learn from that experience?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot to learn from that experience, because the Russians, in fact, they're talking about military modernization since Georgia, are repeating a lot of the same mistakes from that. Fighting a very slow-moving attritional war, relying on tactics like filtration camps and egregious human rights abuses of the same caliber, leveling of cities like Mariupol and Grozny. There's so many reasons why the Russian military, in spite of all of its modernizations, in spite of all of its new look, has really not changed much since Chechnya. So their approach to conflict resolution, similarly, probably won't change either. But there is a difference. Kabasyurt, which was the peace treaty that ended the first Chechen war, was widely regarded by Putin and by hardline nationalists like Alexander Lebed at the time as a failure, right? As a sign, as a capitulation, as a sign that Russia was a country that was prepared with poor leadership under Yeltsin, corruption, infiltration by the West, and Putin has just has framed an image of everything the opposite of that. So using all measures taken necessary to achieve a victory, as we saw in the Second Chechen War and the brutality, being able to keep military presences for long periods of time, even in a low-boil fashion like we see in Syria. So, and Cavazir was invoked during the Istanbul talks in the Russian media as a reason why we shouldn't super peace treaty, Ukraine, because we'll end up having a much bigger problem later on. The Ukrainian military will only get stronger. So the sense in Russia is that instead of last time around where nobody was supporting Chechnya militarily, aside from some financial support sporadically from the Gulf, Chechnya was not going to get any stronger. Ukraine can get stronger. And Russia's position could get even weaker, particularly with sanctions and their inability to replace weaponry that they've expended. So the time to have probably achieved maximum impact was already passed. It was 2014. There's still an avenue to achieve some impact now, but 5 years from now, Ukraine's going to be even harder to invade. So that's why they have to keep pushing. And Putin doesn't want to be Yeltsin either. So that's it.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it sounds like neither side really wants to negotiate. It seems like Ukraine is on the forefront, on the front foot, but for them to get further gains, it's not going to be so easy. So it's not clear that we'll get a quick resolution in the next few months. It still seems like this is going to drag on for some longer period of time.
It's going to drag on for a long period of time. I think, like when I'm talking to Russian analysts now, some are giving very long estimates, like, the Iran-Iraq war, 8 years. So that may be too long. But there are others who believe that, the combination of high gas prices, inflation, and destruction of the Ukrainian economy means that the Russians could have a second wind in a potential counteroffensive in the spring. Where if they can just keep their defensive lines intact, they can maybe strike back again and achieve some results and then be able to bargain from their position of strength. So I think that the Russians see this war lasting probably for a minimum of 6 months to a year, longer than this. And the Ukrainians want to fight till every inch of their territory is occupied. So if Russia does anything to surprise or regain momentum, or if Russia's momentum is just gradually diminishing, that will take 6 months to a year or more. So we're looking at probably this time next year, this war still going on in some form.
Okay, well, I think we could spend more time talking about this, but I think let's put it on hold there. And I should timestamp this conversation as well. We're speaking on Friday, the 16th of September, and obviously by the time people listen or view this, things may have moved on, from what we've talked about. Now, Sam, how can people follow you? By the way, what's the best way of people keeping up with your thoughts?
So, just my day-to-day thoughts on the war, which I talk about like almost every hour, and as well as my book. On this, Putin's War in Ukraine. It's coming out for Oxford University Press and Hearst in end of 2022. I would recommend my Twitter feed, which is Sam Ramani 2.
Okay, great. I'll include in the show notes. I'll include a link to the Twitter account and also a link to the book as well, which is very good. So with that, thanks a lot, Sam. That was excellent and very informative as always, and very balanced and objective as well. So I appreciate the insights you provided.
Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you again.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.